The smell of ozone and burnt copper filled the air. My knuckles were white where I gripped the specialized carbine, its weight a familiar anchor in the disorienting chaos. The simulation chamber was pitch black, a perfect void, but the noise was an assault. A high-frequency shriek, just on the edge of human hearing, vibrated through the floor plates and into the marrow of my bones. It was designed to induce panic, to shatter focus. For the last 3 years, in this windowless facility buried deep in the Nevada desert, they had done everything possible to shatter me. My official designation is Kestrel. My real name was stripped from me, along with my past, the day I signed the non-disclosure agreement with a pen that felt heavier than a gun. I was an Army Ranger with a stellar record and an unfortunate knack for being in the wrong place at the right time, witnessing things that didn't fit neatly into after-action reports. That's what got their attention. They didn't want heroes, they wanted scalpels. Sharp, precise, and emotionally detached. My augmented reality overlay flickered to life in my contact lenses, painting the darkness in the ghostly green and blue of thermal and acoustic signatures. A heat bloom, vaguely humanoid but too tall, too thin, flickered into existence 20 meters to my left. Simultaneously, my acoustic sensors mapped the source of the shriek to a point behind it. A classic pincer maneuver. The training AI was learning. I didn't hesitate. Protocol was king. I dropped to one knee, the ceramic plates of my body armor scraping against the grated floor. I fired 2 controlled bursts at the thermal signature, not to hit it, but to force it to move. As the holographic target dissolved into a shower of pixels, I swiveled, tracking the sound source. The rifle's underbarrel attachment word, launching a small canister that flew in a silent arc. It detonated not with a bang, but with a sudden, profound absence of sound. A sonic dead zone. The torturous shriek vanished, replaced by a ringing in my ears. In the sudden silence, the final target, a squat, dense shape, was revealed by my thermals as it scrambled away from the now silent area. One shot, center mass. The simulation ended. The lights came on with a clinical hum, revealing the stark, padded gray walls of the chamber. A disembodied voice, calm and synthetic, echoed from hidden speakers. Evaluation complete. Vitals returning to baseline. Excellent response time, Kestrel. Proceed to debriefing room Alpha. I ejected the magazine out of pure muscle memory, clearing the chamber before slinging the rifle over my shoulder. Every part of me ached, a deep, cellular exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. But beneath it was the sharp, cold edge of satisfaction. I had passed. Every test, every simulation, every psychological battering, I had weathered it all. Debriefing room Alpha was as sterile as the rest of the facility. White walls, a single metal table, 2 chairs. Dr. Eris Thorne was already there, sitting with his hands steepled, his crisp suit a stark contrast to my sweat-soaked tactical gear. He was a man who existed in shades of gray, from his tailored suits to the flecks in his sharp, intelligent eyes. He looked more like a university dean than the director of the most clandestine agency in the United States government, the Office of Anomalous Biological Containment, or OABC. "Sit, Kestrel," he said, his voice smooth and measured. He never wasted words. I took the chair opposite him, the metal cold through my fatigues. He slid a thin, black folder across the table. It had no markings, no seals, just a single designation typed on a label. Subject T-734. The simulation you just ran was based on fragmented data from your first field assignment. Thorne began, watching my face for any reaction. I gave him none. That was part of the training, too. Congratulations, your training is officially complete. You deploy in 2 hours. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a sensation that was equal parts dread and exhilaration. This was it. The reason for the years of isolation and relentless conditioning. I opened the folder. Inside were satellite images of a small, forgotten town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Black Creek. Population: 412, according to a decade-old census. The subsequent pages contained reports of missing persons. First, a group of hikers on a nearby trail. Then, a local hunter. Last week, a family of 3 vanished from their locked home without a trace. Local law enforcement is calling it a string of bizarre but unrelated disappearances, Thorne continued, his tone flat. They're wrong. Our deep range listening posts in the region picked this up 2 days ago. He tapped a small tablet on the table and a sound file played. It was garbled static at first, but underneath it there was something else. A soft, rhythmic clicking, interspersed with a sound that was disturbingly close to a human whisper, yet subtly wrong. The pitch was too perfect, the cadence too smooth. It was the sound of something mimicking human speech without understanding it. We're calling it the whisper, Thorne said. It seems to possess a powerful mimetic auditory component. Those who hear it are compelled to seek out its source. They walk into the woods and are never seen again. The entity in your simulation was a rough approximation based on this. We believe the shriek is a defense mechanism, used when it feels threatened. My eyes scan the equipment manifest. High-gain parabolic microphones, active noise cancellation gear, and several sonic countermeasure grenades like the one I'd used in the test. The ammunition was listed as subsonic hollow point silver colloid core. Silver? I asked, the first word I'd spoken since entering the room. It sounded foreign, a breach of my stoic conditioning. Thorne allowed himself a small, mirthless smile. A quaint but effective discovery from one of our early cases. Certain elements, for reasons our physicists are still furiously debating, have a disruptive effect on the unique cellular structures of these organisms. They are not supernatural, Kestrel. They are biological. They are simply life that evolved under a different set of rules, hidden in the dark corners of the world. Science refuses to admit they exist because they would have to rewrite every textbook on the planet, and society would collapse under the weight of that truth. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. Your job is not to study it. It is not to capture it. Your mission is to locate Subject Minus 734 and neutralize it, erase it, leave no evidence it was ever there. The official story will be a mine shaft collapse. We handle the rest. The world cannot know, not ever, do you understand? Understood, sir, I said, my voice steady. He nodded, satisfied. Good, get your gear. The helicopter leaves from Pad 3. Welcome to the field, Kestrel. I stood, closed the folder, and walked out of the room without looking back. The sterile white hallways felt different now. They were no longer my prison. They were the last bastion of a reality I was tasked with protecting. As I walked toward the armory, the synthesized whispers from the mission briefing echoed in my mind. For the first time, the line between the simulations and the real world was gone. I was stepping out of the cage, and I was about to find out what was truly waiting in the dark. The air in the debriefing room at Fort Benning was stale, chilled to a precise temperature that was meant to keep you alert, but only made your skin feel tight. For Sergeant Marcus Thorne, it was just another shade of sterile, a world away from the grit and oppressive heat of the Kandahar province. He sat ramrod straight in the uncomfortable chair, his U.S. Army Ranger uniform immaculate, a stark contrast to the chaos replaying on a loop in his mind. The official report was clean, concise. A successful raid, a high-value target eliminated, enemy combatants neutralized. Commendations were already being drafted, but the report was a lie of omission. It didn't mention the sound. A high-frequency chittering that tore through the night, a noise that didn't belong to any animal or machine he knew. It didn't mention the way one of the insurgents had moved after being hit, scuttling into the shadows with a broken leg at an angle that defied human anatomy. And it certainly didn't mention the last thing Marcus saw before the building was leveled by an airstrike. A glimpse of something impossibly thin and pale, unfolding itself from the corner of a darkened room like a carpenter's rule, its limbs bending at sickening, unnatural joints. He hadn't put it in his report. You don't report the impossible. You bury it, hope it stays buried, and deal with the nightmares when they come. The door opened not with the sharp, authoritative click of a superior officer, but with a soft, almost apologetic whisper of oiled hinges. The man who entered was not in uniform. He wore a simple, well-tailored gray suit that seemed out of place in the heart of a military base. He was of average height and build, with thinning hair and thoughtful, intelligent eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a plain black briefcase, setting it down on the metal table between them with a quiet finality. "Sergeant Thorne, thank you for your patience. I am Dr. Eris Thorne." The man's voice was calm, academic. There was no family relation. The shared surname was a coincidence that felt strangely significant. "Sir," Marcus replied, his voice a low rasp, "I was told this was a final psych evaluation." Dr. Thorne offered a small, disarming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A formality? I'm here to discuss a different matter. Your after-action report on Operation Desert Viper. It was a model of efficiency." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder, sliding it across the table. It was stamped with classification markings Marcus had never seen before. Marcus didn't touch it. His hands remained clasped on his lap. "It was a standard engagement, sir." Was it? Thorne's gaze was penetrating, and for the first time, Marcus felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with combat. This was a different kind of threat. Let's talk about what wasn't standard. Let's talk about the acoustic anomalies picked up by your comms, or the biological impossibilities. The air left the room. Marcus's blood ran cold. He had told no one. He had forced the images from his conscious mind, branding them a product of stress, exhaustion, and the fog of war. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." Thorne sighed, a sound of gentle disappointment. He opened the folder. Inside was a single satellite image, grainy but clear enough. It was the target compound, but next to it were biosignature readings and spectrographic analyses that made no sense. He tapped a finger on a specific waveform. "This frequency. It has a fascinating effect on the human cochlea. At high intensity, it can induce a state of profound, paralytic terror. We've seen it before. Rarely." He then slid a second photo out. It wasn't from the raid. It was a morgue photo, stark and clinical. The body on the slab was wrong. Its joints were hyperextended, its skin waxy and translucent. It was hideously, unmistakably similar to the fleeting shape Marcus had seen in the shadows. "My point, Sergeant," Thorne continued softly, "is that you do know what I'm talking about. You saw it, you faced it, and instead of panicking or freezing, you completed your mission. You made a rational choice under irrational circumstances. You compartmentalized. That is a very rare, very valuable skill." Marcus finally broke his silence, his voice tight. "Who are you?" "I represent an organization tasked with addressing these inconsistencies. We operate in the spaces between what is known and what is furiously denied. Science has its dogmas, Sergeant. Its high priests refuse to acknowledge anything that doesn't fit their established models. But the world is older and stranger than they admit, and some of its inhabitants are hostile to our existence." The offer was never stated outright. It was laid out like a diagnosis. The world was sick with things that weren't supposed to exist, and men like Marcus were the only cure. "You have two paths, Sergeant Thorne," the doctor said, his voice even. "Path 1. You accept the commendation. You take some well-deserved leave, you tell yourself what you saw in Kandahar was a trick of the light, and you return to a distinguished career. You will live a full, normal life, and you will be commended for your service. We will ensure this file is buried forever." He gestured to the folder. "Path 2, he paused, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. "You accept that what you saw was real. You accept that your world is a fragile facade, protecting humanity from truths it isn't ready for. You give up your name, your life, everything you are, for a chance to stand on the wall that protects it. It's a thankless, anonymous existence. You will be a ghost, a weapon wielded in the dark. There are no medals on this path. There is no glory. There is only the mission." Marcus stared at the morgue photo, the impossible creature, the thing that shouldn't be. All his training, all his experience, it was built on a foundation of predictable human conflict. But this was something else. This was a war no one else knew was being fought. He thought of the chittering sound, the unnatural movement, the cold, alien intelligence he had sensed in that fleeting moment. He could pretend it wasn't real. He could go back to fighting wars he understood. Or he could fight the one that mattered. He looked up from the photo and met Dr. Thorne's gaze. The choice had already been made in that dusty, blood-soaked building half a world away. He had just needed someone to give it a name. "When do I start?" A genuine smile finally touched Dr. Thorne's lips. It was a grim, knowing expression. He closed the folder, the sound echoing like a cell door locking. "You already have. Your life as Marcus Thorne ended the moment you walked into this room. From now on, you have a designation. Your training begins immediately. Welcome to the Office of Anomalous Biological Containment, Kestrel." The sterile, recycled air of the OABC transport was replaced by the thick, humid breath of the Appalachian Mountains. Kestrel No. Marcus Thorne, freelance journalist, drove the nondescript gray sedan along winding Route 219. The mountains, ancient and cloaked in a dense shroud of oak and hickory, pressed in on either side, swallowing the road. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, painting the asphalt in shifting patterns of light and deep shadow. This wasn't the open, arid terrain of Afghanistan or the controlled geometry of the training facility. This was primal, claustrophobic. Every blind curve was a potential ambush point, every shadowed hollow a potential lair. His training kicked in, cataloging, assessing. The forest wasn't scenery, it was concealment. The first sign for Black Creek was a rust-eaten metal plate, its letters bleeding orange onto the wood post. The town itself appeared suddenly, a wound in the green landscape. It was a place that time had not been kind to. Main Street was a short, grim affair lined with buildings of faded brick and peeling clapboard. A few storefronts showed signs of life. A general store with a dusty display, a diner with a buzzing neon sign, a bar named The Pick and Shovel. But many more were dark, their windows boarded over like closed eyes. A fine layer of coal dust seemed to settle on every surface, a ghostly reminder of the industry that had birthed the town and then abandoned it. The air smelled of damp earth, decay, and the faintest metallic tang of resignation. He parked in front of the only lodging option, the Miners' Rest Motel, a single-story L-shaped building whose white paint was cracking to reveal graying wood beneath. The vacancy sign flickered, one letter dead. He grabbed his duffel bag from the trunk, heavy with civilian clothes, and beneath a false bottom, the tools of his true trade, and walked into the office. A bell chimed weakly. The woman behind the counter didn't look up from her crossword puzzle. She was maybe 60, with hair the color of steel wool and a face etched with the kind of lines that aren't from smiling. "Need a room," Kestrel said, his voice neutral, practiced to sound like any other traveler. She finally lifted her eyes, pale blue and sharp. They took him in from head to toe, a slow, suspicious appraisal. "You lost." "Writing an article," he replied smoothly, offering a well-rehearsed, disarming smile that didn't reach his eyes. On the changing face of industrial America, towns like this have a story to tell. "Not much of a story left here," she said, her voice raspy. "Just the ending." She pushed a registration card and a key attached to a large plastic diamond across the counter. "Room 7, cash only, checkouts at 11. Don't bother nobody and nobody will bother you." "Fair enough," he said, filling out the card with his cover identity. As he paid, he gestured vaguely towards the woods visible beyond the grimy window. "Lots of hiking around here." Her gaze hardened for a fraction of a second. "Not smart to go wandering. Woods are deep. People get turned around." She tapped a pen on a stack of faded missing person flyers on the counter, the face of a smiling young man with a backpack staring up at him. "Some don't get turned back around at all." "I'll keep that in mind, thanks." Room 7 was clean but threadbare. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, the carpet was worn thin, and the air was stale. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and began his ritual. He swept the room for listening devices, a formality, as no one here would have the tech, and then unpacked. The bottom of his duffel opened to reveal his kit. The compact sound dampeners, the multi-spectrum visor, a silenced sidearm, and a small case of custom-loaded ammunition. He was a ghost, and these were his chains. After stowing his gear, he ventured back out. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows down the street. The few people he saw walked with their heads down, their shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. There was no laughter, no casual conversation, just a heavy, oppressive silence that the whispering wind in the trees seemed to mock. On a community bulletin board outside the general store, he saw more flyers. The smiling hiker from the motel desk, a teenage girl, an older man in a hunting cap, all gone, vanished into the deep green maw that surrounded them. He entered the diner. The smell of frying bacon and old coffee hung in the air. He took a seat at the counter, ordering a black coffee from a tired-looking waitress. A few old-timers sat in a booth, speaking in low, hushed tones, their conversation ceasing the moment he walked in. The isolation here was more than geographic, it was psychological. These people were bound by a shared, unspoken fear. Kestrel nursed his coffee, listening. He didn't need to ask questions directly. He just needed to be a void, and the ambient anxiety of the room would fill it. He caught fragments. Heard it again last night up by the ridge, and sheriff ain't doing nothing 'cause there's nothing to do, and just stays in after dark now. He paid for his coffee and left a generous tip, then walked to the trailhead mentioned on the hiker's flyer. Hawks Peak Trail. It was a few miles out of town, the road turning from cracked asphalt to gravel. The sun had dipped below the ridgeline, and the world was bathed in the gray twilight of dusk. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept up his spine. He parked the sedan and got out. The silence here was different, deeper, more absolute. It felt like the world was holding its breath. He slipped on his visor, switching it to the thermal spectrum. The world bloomed into a landscape of heat signatures. A deer moving through the underbrush. A raccoon scurrying up a tree. He followed the trail, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. His mission parameters were clear: recon, confirm, and locate. Do not engage, not yet. About a half-mile in, something snagged his attention. A faint trail branching off the main path, marked by a couple of broken twigs. It was too subtle for a casual hiker, but to his trained eye, it was a flashing light. He followed it, moving deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a suffocating tunnel of foliage. He found it another 100 yards in. A small, hastily abandoned campsite. A half-charred fire pit. A sleeping bag, unrolled and damp with dew. And next to it, a single hiking boot, its laces undone, stuck deep in the mud as if its owner had been pulled right out of it. Kestrel knelt, his senses on high alert. He scanned the area. No blood, no signs of a struggle with any known predator. Then he saw it. Tucked under a fern near the boot was a small, black digital audio recorder. The hiker's. His gloved fingers carefully picked it up. He pressed play. The hiss of static, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of wind, normal forest sounds. He fast-forwarded, listening intently. And then he heard it. Faint in the background, but unmistakable. It wasn't a cry or a scream. It was a melody. A soft, intricate series of chimes and whispers that seemed to weave in and out of the natural sounds of the forest. It was hypnotic, beautiful, and deeply, fundamentally wrong. It resonated in his bones, a siren's call that promised peace and delivered oblivion. This was the acoustic lure Dr. Thorne had described. The sound of Subject Minus 734. As the recording ended, his flashlight beam caught a glimmer on the bark of the tree nearest the boot. It wasn't sap. It was a patch of thin, crystalline resin shimmering with a faint, internal luminescence. He carefully scraped a sample into a sterile vial. The evidence was irrefutable. The whisper was here, and it was active. The simulation was over. The hunt had begun. The sterile, chemical smell of the Black Creek motel room was a temporary anchor to reality. On the worn-out desk, Kestrel's portable analysis unit hummed quietly, its small screen displaying the waveform of the sound he'd captured. It was chaotic, a jumble of frequencies that, according to the machine, shouldn't exist together. Below it, a Petri dish held the translucent resin. The biosensor probe returned its initial findings: a complex protein silica matrix, organic but with a structure unlike any known terrestrial biology. It was an excretion, a marker. Subject -734 was leaving a trail. He cross-referenced the data with the OABC's database via a satellite link scrambler that looked like a simple power bank. No matches. This thing was new, undocumented beyond the vague reports that had brought him here. He shut down the equipment. Analysis was done. Action was required. Dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the West Virginia hills as he returned to the trailhead. He wasn't dressed as a journalist anymore. He wore dark, non-reflective tactical pants and a softshell jacket over a thin layer of body armor. His pack was light, containing only essentials: water, medkit, a multi-spectrum imager, and the X-12 Stinger, a carbine that fired custom-loaded rounds designed to incapacitate, not just kill. His primary defense, however, was plugged into his ears. The acoustic dampeners were programmed to actively cancel the specific frequency range he'd isolated from the recording. A theoretical countermeasure. He was about to find out if theory held up. He moved past the abandoned campsite, melting into the thick woods as the last light failed. The forest was not silent. It was a chorus of insects, rustling leaves, and the distant call of a whippoorwill. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his boots making almost no sound on the damp earth. His eyes, adjusted to the gloom, scanned the terrain not for a path but for anomalies. He found the first sign 20 minutes in. A thick branch, 10 feet up an old oak, snapped cleanly. Too high for a deer, too thick for a bobcat. He ran a gloved finger along the break, and it came back with a faint, sticky residue. The resin? He was on the right track. He moved onward, deeper into the oppressive darkness, guided by his training and the subtle wrongness the creature left in its wake. The trail grew colder, but not in temperature. The ambient noise of the forest began to fall away. The insect chirps quieted, the rustling ceased. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. This was a known environmental reaction to several anomalous entities, a bioacoustic dead zone. He slowed his pace, the stinger held in a low-ready position. He found the next marker near a shallow creek bed, a worn leather hiking boot, half buried in the mud. It was laced tight, but there was no sign of its owner. A few feet away, almost invisible against the dark stone, was another smear of the resin. He was getting closer. The silence was now absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled even his own breathing. And then it started. It wasn't a sound that his ears registered at first. The dampeners were working, filtering the primary frequency. But this was more than a sound. It was a pressure, a vibration that resonated in his bones. It slipped past the technology, a phantom whisper that bloomed directly in his mind. "Marcus, it's okay. You can rest now." Kestrel froze. The voice was a composite, a flawless echo of his mother's warmth and his father's reassuring baritone. It was a sound of safety, of home, of a time before the training, before the things he'd done and seen. It promised an end to the hypervigilance, the loneliness, the crushing weight of the mission. A powerful, seductive lie. "Subject is employing a secondary, mimetic audio lure," he muttered, his voice a harsh rasp in the silence. His training screamed at him: acknowledge, analyze, counter. He began the breathing exercises, the 4-count inhale, 4-count hold, 4-count exhale. He recited his designation, his mission parameters, anything to fill his head with cold logic instead of warm nostalgia. But the lure adapted. It wasn't just a voice anymore. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. A sweltering Kandahar afternoon, the coppery smell of blood, the face of a young private, his friend, looking at him with surprise as his life slipped away. The whisper took that image and twisted it. "You could have saved him, Marcus. If you were faster, if you were better. It's not your fault you can let that go. Just come here. It will all be over." The grief was a physical blow, a sudden, gut-wrenching agony he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. His resolve wavered. His finger tensed on the trigger. For a split second, he wanted nothing more than to walk toward the sound, to embrace the oblivion it offered. Asset designation, Kestrel. Objective, neutralize subject minus 734. The mantra, drilled into him until it was part of his DNA, cut through the emotional fog. He blinked hard, the forest swimming back into focus. Through a gap in the trees, on a low ridge about 50 yards away, he saw it. It was not a monster of teeth and claws. It was a silhouette, tall and unnervingly thin, that seemed to bend the light around it, its edges blurring into the surrounding trees. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, but its limbs were too long, its posture subtly wrong. It didn't move, it simply was. And as he watched, a faint, phosphorescent light pulsed from its core, in time with the phantom voice in his head. He knew, with absolute certainty, that to engage now would be suicide. The psychological attack was too effective. His dampeners were only partially successful, and his mental conditioning was being eroded with every second. This was no longer a hunt. It was a tactical problem he was not equipped to solve. With a smooth, practiced motion, he holstered his carbine and pulled a flashbang grenade from his belt. He didn't arm it to stun the creature. He armed it to stun himself. Pulling the pin, he tossed it a few feet in front of him, turning his head away and clamping his eyes shut. The world erupted in white light and deafening sound. The brilliant flash overloaded his senses, and the concussive bang was a sledgehammer of pure noise that shattered the whisper's delicate, insidious lure. The voice in his head vanished, replaced by a painful ringing in his ears. When he opened his eyes, the silhouette on the ridge was gone. The normal sounds of the forest began to creep back in, tentative at first, then growing stronger. The dead zone was receding. He was alone again. Kestrel didn't wait. He turned and began a swift, silent retreat, his mind already working. The mission parameters had changed. This wasn't a simple predator. It was an intelligent hunter that used emotion as a weapon, and it had found his. The air in the debriefing room at Ramstein Air Base was sterile, chilled, and tasted of antiseptic. It was a stark contrast to the black forest mud caked under Sergeant Marcus Thorne's fingernails, and the metallic tang of blood he couldn't wash from his mouth. He sat at a steel table, his reflection a pale, hollow-eyed ghost on its polished surface. Opposite him sat Colonel Hayes, a man whose face was a roadmap of skepticism, and a base psychologist whose pen scratched incessant, judgmental notes. "For the last time, Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice a low growl of impatience. "What happened to your team?" Marcus stared at the water condensation on the metal pitcher, watching a single droplet trace a path down its side. "I told you, sir. It wasn't insurgents. It wasn't Spetsnaz. It was wrong." The psychologist, a woman named Dr. Evans, leaned forward. "Marcus, it's common for the mind to create narratives to cope with extreme trauma. The loss of your entire squad." "I didn't create anything," Marcus snapped, his voice cracking. The memories were a maelstrom, threatening to pull him under. The mission had been simple: long-range reconnaissance near the Czech border. 4 days of quiet observation, watching a suspected smuggling route. The forest was ancient, claustrophobic. The air grew still on the third night. The birds went silent. That was the first sign. Then came the sound. Not a footstep, not a whisper. It was a low, guttural clicking, like 1,000 insects chattering in unison, but with a weight, a resonance that vibrated through the soil and up into their bones. Corporal Diaz, their point man, froze. He raised a hand, his eyes wide in the gloom of their night vision goggles. "What followed wasn't a firefight," Marcus explained, his gaze distant, replaying the horror. "A firefight has muzzle flashes, commands, return fire. This was a harvest." Something blurred from the trees. It was a flicker of motion at the edge of perception, impossibly fast. Diaz was gone. No scream, just a wet, tearing sound and the sudden silence where his breathing had been. Panic erupted. They laid down suppressive fire into the darkness, their rounds thudding into ancient oaks and disappearing into the void. Nothing fired back. Then Peterson was snatched from the right flank. Again, the blur, a choked cry and silence. It was intelligent. It was flanking them, using the darkness, moving in ways nothing human could. It didn't have a heat signature. Their thermals were useless. All they could see was a cold spot, a void where a predator should have been. It was tall, Marcus whispered, the words scraping his throat, and thin, bent, like a praying mantis made of shadows and bone. It moved on all fours but stood on two legs. It didn't make sense. He and Riley, the last two, had broken for a rocky outcropping. The clicking was all around them, a disorienting, predatory sonar. Riley screamed as something long and barbed shot from the dark, impaling his leg and dragging him back into the trees. Marcus had emptied his magazine, firing blindly at the sound of his friend's final, gurgling plea. And then he just ran. He ran until the sun came up, until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, the clicking finally fading behind him. Colonel Hayes sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Sergeant, your entire squad is gone. We found their gear, comms disabled, blood everywhere. But we found no enemy bodies, no brass other than our own. The official report will state you were ambushed by an unknown force. Unofficially," he gestured to Dr. Evans, "you're clearly suffering a psychotic break. You'll be on a medical transport back to Walter Reed by morning." A cold dread, heavier than any fear he'd felt in the forest, settled in Marcus's gut. They didn't believe him. He was the sole survivor, and they were going to bury him in a psych ward. He was a crazy soldier, another casualty of a war no one understood. "I know what I saw," he said, his voice flat with defeat. Just then, the door opened without a knock. A man in a simple, well-tailored gray suit stepped inside. He was of average height and build, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic air. He carried a thin, black portfolio. He paid no mind to Marcus, addressing the colonel directly. "Colonel Hayes," the man said, his voice calm and precise, "your presence is no longer required, nor is yours, Doctor." He didn't raise his voice, yet it held an undeniable authority that made the colonel, a man who commanded thousands of soldiers, stiffen. "And who the hell are you?" Hayes demanded. The man simply slid a laminated ID across the table. Hayes glanced at it, and the color drained from his face. The clearance level, the issuing agency, it was something he'd only ever heard rumors about. He stood abruptly. "Dr. Evans, with me? Now." They were gone in seconds, the door clicking shut behind them, leaving Marcus alone with the quiet civilian. The man took the seat the colonel had vacated. He opened his portfolio, his movements deliberate. "My name is Dr. Thorne," he said, his eyes finally meeting Marcus's. They were intelligent, analytical, and held no trace of pity. "I'm with the Office of Anomalous Biological Containment, and for the record, Sergeant, I believe every word you said." Marcus stared, speechless. Thorne slid a photograph across the table. It was a satellite image, grainy but clear, of the forest where the attack had happened. He pointed a slender finger at a specific spot. "We detected a significant bioenergetic discharge in this sector 36 hours ago. An event signature we've seen before, twice in the Urals, once in the jungles of Borneo." He then produced a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside was a shard of something that looked like obsidian but was clearly organic. It was serrated, like the tip of a claw or mandible. "My team recovered this from the body of Corporal Riley," Thorne said evenly. "It doesn't match any known phylum on Earth. We call the organism Subjectminus 217. You were right, it hunts from the cold. It uses its environment, and it is lethally intelligent." Relief washed over Marcus so intensely it made him dizzy. It was real, he wasn't crazy. What do you want from me?" Marcus asked. "The same thing you want," Thorne replied, folding his hands. "A reckoning. You have a unique qualification, Sergeant. You are one of a handful of people on this planet to have encountered a Classminus 4 hostile organism and survived. Most soldiers who see what you saw are either killed or lose their minds. But you retained your tactical awareness. You adapted. You ran. That is not cowardice. It is a superior survival instinct. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. The world you thought you knew is a carefully curated fantasy. There are things that slip through the cracks, things that science refuses to acknowledge and that nature wished it had forgotten. My organization finds them. We study them. And when necessary, we eliminate them. We need people who can face the impossible and not break. People who have already been broken and put themselves back together. Thorne's offer hung in the silent room. It wasn't a promise of healing or peace. It was a promise of purpose. A chance to turn the horror that had shattered his life into a weapon. You have two paths, Thorne concluded, his tone clinical. You can get on that transport to Walter Reed, where you will be medicated into forgetting, your career and reputation destroyed. Or you can come with me. You'll be a ghost. Your records will be erased. Marcus Thorne will cease to exist, but you will have the chance to hunt the things that live in the dark. Marcus looked at his own shaking hands, then at the cold, steady gaze of the man offering him a key to a world of nightmares. He had lost his team, his career, and nearly his sanity. He had nothing left to lose. The choice was no choice at all. "When do we start?" Marcus asked. The rain in the Ardennes was a cold, constant thing. It wasn't the dramatic downpour of a summer storm, but a miserable, soaking drizzle that seeped into the collar of your fatigues and chilled you to the bone. Sergeant Marcus Thorne felt it run down his neck, but he ignored it. Discomfort was a currency you spent freely on missions like this. He scanned the dense, ancient forest, the trees clawing at a sky the color of wet concrete. The fog clung to the ground, swallowing sound and sight beyond 20 yards. "Anything, Spectre?" Marcus whispered into his comms, his voice a low rumble. "Negative, Sergeant," Corporal Davis replied, his voice a tinny ghost in Marcus's ear. "Just trees and mud. You sure intel was good on this? Feels like a wild goose chase." "Intel is what it is," Marcus said, shifting the weight of his rifle. "We find the asset, we go home. Simple as that." The mission was anything but simple. They were a 6-man Special Forces team, officially tasked with locating a downed experimental surveillance drone deep in a restricted military zone near the Belgian-German border. Unofficially, the drone had gone silent after transmitting a single, garbled data packet filled with screaming. The brass didn't like that. They wanted their expensive toy back and an explanation for the noise. His men were the best. Davis, the comms specialist and eternal pessimist. Rook and Bishop, the heavy weapons twins who moved with unsettling synchronicity. Perez, the medic, who could patch a wound in the dark with one hand. And Lieutenant Miller, a fresh-faced officer technically in command, but smart enough to defer to Marcus's decade of experience in the field. "Movement," Miller hissed, pointing to the left flank. Marcus's head snapped around, eyes straining to pierce the gloom. For a second, he saw it. A flicker. Not a person, not an animal. It was a distortion in the rain, a patch of air that seemed to bend light around it before vanishing. It was gone before his brain could fully process the impossible geometry of it. "Hold," Marcus ordered. The team froze, melting into the landscape. The only sound was the drip of water from ancient branches and the thumping of his own heart. The forest felt wrong. He'd operated in jungles, deserts, and frozen tundras. He knew the feeling of being watched, the subtle shift in atmosphere that signaled an enemy's presence. This was different. This felt like the forest itself was sick. "I've got nothing on thermals," Rook reported, his voice tight. "Not even a rabbit." That was the first real sign. A forest this size should be teeming with life. But there were no birds, no insects, no rustling in the undergrowth, just silence and the rain. Then came the sound. A wet, chitinous clicking from all directions at once. It was the sound of 1,000 snapped twigs, 1,000,000 broken insects, all orchestrated into a rhythm that grated on the nerves. Perez fumbled with his rifle, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" "Stay frosty," Marcus commanded, his own voice betraying a tremor he hated. "Form a perimeter, watch your sectors." The clicking grew louder, closer, and then Bishop screamed. It was a choked, wet sound, cut off as quickly as it began. Marcus spun to see Bishop's position. He was gone. His heavy machine gun lay in the mud, its barrel pointed at the sky. A thick, dark spray painted the ferns behind where he'd stood. "Contact! Contact!" Miller yelled, firing blindly into the fog. The controlled discipline of the squad shattered into pure, primal panic. The clicking was deafening now, a frantic, skittering noise that seemed to come from inside his own skull. "Rook, where is it?" Marcus bellowed. "Everywhere, it's everywhere." Rook screamed back, his own weapon spitting fire into the trees. Marcus saw another flicker of motion, a disjointed limb of pale white and too many joints, impossibly fast. It moved between the raindrops. He fired a 3-round burst where it had been, the bullets tearing through empty air and rotting leaves. Perez went next. He didn't even make a sound. One moment he was there, trying to reload, and the next he was just gone. A drag mark in the mud was the only evidence he'd ever existed. "Fall back to the extraction point." "Now," Marcus roared, grabbing the lieutenant by his vest and hauling him backward. But Miller's eyes were glassy with terror. He was paralyzed. "We can't, it's—" Miller stammered before a blur of motion coalesced behind him. Marcus saw it for a split second. A thing of nightmare logic, a silhouette of disjointed angles and limbs that moved like a broken film. Before he could even shout a warning, it struck. The sound was like a side of beef being slammed onto concrete. The lieutenant crumpled without a word. It was just him and Davis. The comms specialist was backed against a massive oak, firing his carbine on full auto, the brass casings ejecting in a useless, glittering arc. "It's not dying. Sergeant, it's not dying." Marcus laid down suppressing fire, trying to give Davis a chance to move, but he knew it was over. He was firing at ghosts, at flickers in the fog. The thing, or things, were toying with them, picking them apart with a horrifying, surgical precision that defied all military tactics. He saw it again, this time to Davis's right. It unfolded itself from the shadow of a tree. A pale, spindly horror that was all bone and speed. Marcus screamed a wordless denial and fired, but it was already on Davis, a whirlwind of silent, tearing motion. He was alone. The clicking stopped. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise. He was standing in a clearing of death, surrounded by the ghosts of his men. Rain washed the blood from the leaves, turning the muddy ground a sickening shade of pink. He didn't run. His training, his will, his entire being was shattered. He simply stood there, drenched and trembling, waiting for the flicker in the rain to come for him. But it never did. He stood there for an hour, or maybe it was a lifetime, until the sound of a rescue helicopter's rotors finally cut through the oppressive silence. When they found him, he was still standing, his rifle empty, his eyes fixed on the spot where he'd last seen the impossible creature. In the sterile debriefing room back at base, they called it combat fatigue, mass hysteria. They suggested he'd shot his own men in a fog-induced panic. His report was classified as incoherent. He was a hero one day and a liability the next. The psychiatric evaluation was a formality. He was broken, and the Army had no use for broken soldiers. Days later, in a quiet observation room that felt more like a cell, the door opened. A man in a simple, perfectly tailored gray suit stepped inside. He wasn't military, but he moved with an authority that dwarfed any General Marcus had ever met. He had calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the shattered shell of Sergeant Thorne. "Sergeant," the man said, his voice even. "My name is Dr. Thorne. I've read your report, the real one, not the fiction your superiors concocted." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm here because I believe you, and I want to offer you a chance to hunt the things that science refuses to admit exist." The cold was a constant, unwelcome companion. For 2 days, I had moved through the dense Appalachian forest, not as a hunter, but as a ghost. My retreat had been a calculated one, a feigned weakness designed to lull the creature into a false sense of dominance. Back in the sterile anonymity of a mobile OABC command post, a converted delivery truck parked in a neighboring county, I had dissected my failure with Dr. Thorne. There was no recrimination in his voice, only cold, hard analysis. We had underestimated Subject-700 and 34's mimetic capabilities. My standard issue psionic dampeners were built to resist general psychic intrusion, not a targeted assault exploiting specific neural pathways of trauma. Now, I was back, armed with new knowledge and new hardware. Strapped to my tactical vest was the nullifier, a device that looked like a modified directional speaker. It wouldn't block the sound, Thorne had explained, but it would emit a cascading series of counterfrequencies designed to scramble the mimetic payload, rendering the auditory attack into meaningless, if unsettling, noise. My other weapon was psychological. I had spent 48 hours in a sensory deprivation tank, forced to confront the Ardennes not as a memory, but as data. I replayed every second, every scream, every mistake. I stripped it of its emotional power until all that was left was a tactical scenario. A failure, yes, but one to be learned from, not crippled by. I had to turn my greatest weakness into a shield. My chosen ground was a narrow ravine carved by a shallow, fast-moving creek, the very one that gave the town its name. The terrain was treacherous, littered with slick, moss-covered boulders and tangled roots. It limited mobility, forcing any engagement into a brutal, close-quarters affair. It was a kill box. I had set my lure at the ravine's mouth. The audio recorder from the campsite connected to a small, powerful amplifier. With a flick of a switch on my wrist-mounted control, it began broadcasting the creature's own unsettling hum into the twilight woods. I was challenging it, invading its territory with its own voice. Then, I melted into the shadows higher up the ravine wall, my rifle resting on a rock, the nullifier aimed at the choke point below. An hour passed in absolute silence, the only sound the rushing water and the looped, alien hum from my lure. Then, the broadcast cut out. The forest held its breath. A wave of psychic pressure washed over me, a familiar, sickening dread. The whispers started, not from the trees this time, but inside my own head. It was Ramirez's voice pleading. "Sarge, where are you? They're everywhere." I gritted my teeth, my thumb hovering over the nullifier's activation switch. Not yet. I needed a visual. The creature was smarter than I'd anticipated. It was probing, trying to draw me out before revealing itself. The whispers intensified, weaving a tapestry of my failure. The crackle of the radio, the wet, tearing sounds, the final, choked gasp of my radio man. My heart hammered against my ribs, a primal fear trying to claw its way up my throat. Data, I told myself, the word a mantra. It's just data, echoes, not real. A flicker of movement below. It was impossibly fast, a pale, elongated blur against the darkening woods. It moved on all fours, its limbs bending at angles that defied conventional anatomy. It was gaunt, its skin the color of old parchment stretched tight over a skeletal frame. As it drew closer to the lure, it paused, its head tilting. It had no discernible face, just a smooth expanse of flesh, but a vertical slit in its throat pulsed rhythmically, the source of the subsonic dread I felt vibrating in my bones. It was in the kill zone. I activated the nullifier. A high-frequency whine, barely audible to the human ear, sliced through the air. The psychic assault didn't stop, but it warped. Ramirez's pleas twisted into distorted, meaningless syllables, the emotional weight behind them dissolving like smoke. The creature recoiled, letting out a shriek that was pure physical sound, a piercing, bone-jarring cry of pain and confusion. Its primary weapon was compromised. I fired. The custom-built rifle bucked against my shoulder, sending a 308 incendiary round screaming across the ravine. It struck the creature in the shoulder, and for a moment, it was wreathed in white-hot chemical fire. The shriek it let out was one of pure agony, but it wasn't down. It lunged, not away, but towards me, scrambling up the rock face with terrifying speed, its long, claw-like fingers finding purchase in the stone. Its physical prowess was just as dangerous as its psychic abilities. I fired again, but it was moving too fast, a blur of pale limbs and raw fury. It crashed into me, the impact throwing us both from the ledge. We tumbled down the rocky slope, a tangle of limbs and violence. My head struck a rock and stars exploded behind my eyes. The rifle was gone, knocked from my grasp. The creature was on top of me, its faceless head inches from mine, its lipless slit of a mouth gaping open. A low, guttural growl replaced the whispers, a sound of pure, predatory hatred. My training took over. I ignored the searing pain in my shoulder where its claw had dug in. I drove the heel of my boot into its knee joint, rewarded with a sickening crunch and a screech of pain. The pressure on my chest lessened. I twisted, grabbing the combat knife from my vest. It swiped at me, its claws tearing through the fabric of my sleeve and scoring deep gouges in my forearm. I roared, a sound of pure, desperate survival, and drove the blade up and under its jaw, sinking it deep into its throat where the vocal slit pulsed. There was no scream, just a wet, gurgling sound and a final, violent tremor that ran through its body. It collapsed on top of me, a dead weight. For a long moment, I lay there, gasping for air, the coppery scent of its strange blood filling my nostrils. The psychic pressure was gone. The forest was silent, save for the creak and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. Slowly, painfully, I pushed its corpse off me and staggered to my feet. I collected my rifle, took the required tissue samples with a trembling hand, and destroyed the lure. My mission was complete. I keyed my comms, my voice raspy. "Thorn, Kestrel here." His voice came back instantly, devoid of emotion. "Status, Kestrel. Subject -734 is neutralized," I said, looking at the pale form lying by the water's edge. "Repeat, target is eliminated. Requesting exfil." "Acknowledged," he replied. "Rendezvous at the extraction point in 2 hours. Well done, Kestrel." The line went dead. There was no praise, no commendation, just a simple acknowledgement of a job completed, and that was enough. As I limped out of the forest, leaving the shadows of Black Creek behind, I knew something had fundamentally changed. The ghosts of the Ardennes were still there, but they were quieter now. They were no longer my masters. They were data. I wasn't just Sergeant Marcus Thorn, the survivor. I was Kestrel, the agent. I had a new purpose, forged in the silent, clandestine war against the things that lurked just outside the edges of belief. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning.